UPADESA SARAM, Essence of Teachings, offered by Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharishi. Verses 6 to 10. Uttamastavad Uccha Mandata Chittajam Japa Dhyanam Uttamam. Japa, chanting, done as loud repetition of God's name or mantra, is better than praising God. Quiet chanting within the mouth is even better, but the best method is silent repetition in the mind, which is called meditation. Explanation for this verse is as follows. The order of excellence of spiritual practices is specified by Maharishi in this verse. The state of mind of a person, or how restless and weak the mind is at a given time, could determine which of the above practices is suitable at that time. When the mind is very restless and the tormenting thoughts are difficult to evade or ward off, loud japa, chanting, may be very helpful in making the mind a little less turbulent. It is like placing a chain in the elephant's trunk to keep it from moving here and there restlessly. But when one is able to achieve a little quietness in the mind, a quiet japa with the mouth but without sound is a better practice than loud japa mentioned earlier. However, the best practice is to quietly contemplate in the mind, which is called meditation. Ajya dharaya shrotasa samam sarala chintanam viralata param. Better than meditation with breaks is meditation in a steady, continuous flow, like the flow of oil or of a perennial stream. Explanation for this verse is as follows. In the early stages of meditation, when a person begins to meditate, avoiding or controlling thoughts may seem difficult. The mind may wander and start roaming around with a multitude of thoughts about people, things, events, and so on. Then, when the person realizes that the mind has strayed away into worldly matters, the mind is then brought back to meditation. In this verse, Maharishi declares that better than this kind of meditation with breaks is a steady, continuous, unbroken flow of meditation, just like the flow of oil when it is poured, or the flow of water in a perennial stream. Keeping this advice from Maharishi in mind, when one engages in meditation, it will help immensely to keep the meditation in a continuous flow. Bheda bhavanat soha mityasau bhavanabhida pavani mata. Meditation without the idea of separateness, that God is distinct from oneself, having the attitude that He is I, without the concept of separateness, is considered more purifying. Explanation for this verse is as follows. An ordinary person starts praying to God or worshipping God with the notion that God is separate from oneself. This is the typical concept of pretty much every person in this world. This is the idea of duality, Dvaita. A person begins with dissatisfaction Not content with the world, prayers to God are offered for the satisfaction of desires. By praying to God, the mind is purified to an extent. The person who so far worshipped God to fulfill personal, materialistic, or worldly desires now finds that worldly objects and happenings don't provide true happiness or peace of mind, and that God alone can provide them. Also, there comes the longing to know God more than just to satisfy the carnal desires. As the person advances spiritually even further, the principle of Advaita, non-duality, appears strongly in the mind. According to Advaita, non-duality, there is only one supreme reality, Brahman, and the individual jiva and the universe perceived are only manifestations of this supreme reality or consciousness. According to Ramana Maharishi, the individual consciousness is only a reflection of the supreme consciousness, and the goal of a spiritual seeker is to merge this individual consciousness into the Supreme One, which is also called the heart. It is like a river merging into the ocean. Now the question is, in order to achieve this merging, what kind of meditation is required? Maharishi provides the answer in this verse. He declares that meditating on God with the notion that God is I, without the concept of separateness between the two, is better and more purifying than worshipping God with the idea of God and individual being separate entities. A note of caution should be mentioned here. The notion God is I should not be confused with an egotistical, narcissistic, power-mongering, tyrannical personality. On the other hand, it is only with absolute humility and an attitude of surrendering the ego to the higher that meditation on God with the notion God is I can be performed as indicated in this verse. It is in fact giving up the limited, imperfect self to gain and be the limitless perfection. Bhava Sunya Sad, Bhava Susthiti, Bhavana Balat, Bhakti Ruttama. To firmly abide in the self that transcends all thought, by reason of the strength gained by intense contemplation, this is supreme devotion. Explanation for this verse is as follows. Usually, devotion, bhakti, is said to be love and reverence for God. One worships God with such devotion by body, voice, and mind. Devotion with duality means thinking that God is somewhere over there in heaven and I am here on earth. That is, thinking that God and the individual are separate and different. Devotion or bhakti requires thoughts. Thought involves a subject to think, the object of thought, and the thinking process, perceived as three distinct factors. But the Supreme Self is beyond these three. In the previous verse, Maharishi showed how one starts with devotion with a sense of difference between oneself and God. Then the person is advised that it is better to meditate on God with the notion God is I than with the concept that God and I are separate. In this verse, he clarifies that even though devotion with duality is good to start with, supreme devotion consists of losing the feeling of separateness between God and oneself and abiding as the Supreme Self. Maharishi teaches us about one more thing in this verse. In addition to saying that supreme devotion is to firmly abide in the self that is beyond all thoughts, he adds that this is accomplished by the strength gained by thought and intense contemplation. Thus, Maharishi declares in this verse that supreme devotion is to firmly abide in the self that transcends all thought by reason of the strength gained by intense contemplation. Hristale mana swasthata kriya bhakti yoga bodhascha nischitam. Abidance of the mind in one's source, the heart center, is certainly what the paths of karma, bhakti, yoga, and bodha are. Explanation for this verse is as follows. Karma is performing selfless actions. Bhakti is devotion to God. Yoga literally means union, indicating the union of the individual self with the Supreme Being, but it also means the physical practices and austerities performed. Bodha is jnana or knowledge through self-enquiry. Usually, these four spiritual practices are considered to be separate and different, each taking its own course and producing unique results of its own. But in this verse, Ramana Maharishi explains that all these seemingly different paths are all essentially only one thing, and that is the firm abidance of the mind in the self, the absorption into one's source, the heart center, losing the individual consciousness to merge into the Supreme Consciousness and abide as the immortal, eternal, blissful being or self. How do these four paths teach only absorption into the source? When selfless actions are performed, dedicating them to God, the individual self blends with the universe and thus gets absorbed in the higher. When intense devotion is practiced, the individual self melts in devotion, loses its identity, and merges in God. When physical austerities are followed, they are done with reverence to God and with a view of union between the individual self and the Supreme Self. And when deep contemplation or self-enquiry is performed, the individual self consciously merges into the Supreme Self and gets absorbed in the heart center. Therefore, Maharishi says that all these four paths, karma, bhakti, yoga, and bodha, also called jnana, actually only lead to the absorption of the mind into one's own source, the heart center.